All right, welcome to part 2 of this lecture. I will be providing you with links to various things I'll be mentioning in this lecture, either by email or in a kind of comment box somewhere on this YouTube clip. So I'd first like you to listen to this piece titled Native American Tribes Run Project to Fight Homelessness. So go ahead and pause this lecture, listen to that 5-minute radio piece, and then please come back to my lecture. All right, so at this point, I assume that you have gone ahead and listened to that piece. I'd now like you to imagine that you are an anthropologist who's been hired to help run this project you just listened to. How would you go about doing this work? What sorts of questions would you ask as an anthropologist? What sorts of issues would you focus on? So if you'd like to pause this video and listen again to that radio piece, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I'll encourage you to take a minute or two to reflect on this series of questions and go ahead and put your responses into our class Google Doc. You'll find an area near the end of that Google Doc where you can respond to this piece. Again, here you see that we're trying to think about how it is that we can apply the perspective of an anthropologist to kind of broader social human problems. So again, go ahead and pause this video, re-listen to that radio clip, or go right ahead and open our class Google Doc and share your thoughts. How would you run this project? What questions would you ask if you were a cultural anthropologist who was hired as a part of this broader project? Okay, so I will assume that you have just finished that activity, and we're going to move forward in this lecture with the first major concept in this part 2 of the lecture, which is that of culture of poverty. Culture of poverty. This is the idea that those people who are born into a culture of poverty will then go ahead and pass it on to their children. This theory is this idea that there are certain cultural traits, quotes, that can be found in poor populations, and in particular in the urban United States. This comes to us from Oscar Lewis, who showed that orality, O-R-A-L-I-T-Y, so speaking as opposed to writing, right? Orally telling stories as opposed to fostering a culture of literacy, strong present time orientation, in other words, thinking about today's needs rather than tomorrow's needs, that these are cultural traits shared among Puerto Rican, Black, and poor white Americans. Now, as I will argue, right, this is a problematic theory that cultural anthropologists do not agree with. But nevertheless, this concept of the culture of poverty became quite popular and remains quite popular within mainstream popular discourse in the United States. In fact, Oscar Lewis himself, who wrote about this concept of culture of poverty, he actually thought that the government should step up and provide or help support needy communities. However, other people took his idea, culture of poverty, and kind of twisted it as evidence for supporting that poor people are poor because of their cultural decisions rather than the structural situation in which they find themselves. And Oscar Lewis was really disturbed that his idea of culture of poverty concept was incorrectly used as evidence to support this false notion that poor people are poor because of their culture, right? Because they're simply lazy, etc. In fact, Lewis once said, quote, "There is nothing in the concept being culture of poverty, that puts the onus of poverty on the character of the poor. In other words, he basically says, look, there's nothing about my idea, this idea of culture of poverty, that says that poor people, it's their burden to fix their problems completely. But yeah, culture of poverty style explanations are super common in the United States, right? You can hear it all over the media. If we believe that, if we all believe that our society gives everybody equal opportunities, if that's what we believe, if we believe in the American dream, right, then it is common sense to conclude that people who don't do well simply don't do well because, right, they're to blame. They didn't do a great job taking advantage of the opportunities before them. And so, but people who believe that can buy into this culture of poverty way of thinking. But the anthropological response to culture of poverty recognizes that even though, of course, right, personal characteristics, decisions play a big role in our lives, so don't larger structural issues, questions, and forces, right? These are the less visible, like literally visible social structures that lead to structural violence, which constrains people's opportunities and restricts their chances getting out of poverty or achieving good health, right? So the culture of poverty concept ignores broader historical and structural power dynamics, as I've written here, like the legacy of slavery and colonization, like corporate capitalism. If you're to think back to Deloria's critique of kind of earlier anthropology, of course, that's also present there too, right? If you're writing a kind of anthropology that just looks at cultural rituals, right, but doesn't attend to, right, the real historical issue of genocide and cultural genocide and literal human genocide in terms of Native American history, then we're not really getting at the root of the issue, right? Are we? So culture of poverty is problematic because it blames victims, it blames poor people, people living with addiction, um, for their issues completely, right? It doesn't acknowledge or, admit that also, wealth that you might acquire in childhood will determine your social standings and opportunities that are available to you through adulthood and into old age. So here are some pictures. This is an image of Oscar Lewis here alongside the book and with an introduction by Margaret Mead. Look at that, the book that kind of contained this idea of culture of poverty, right? So the idea again is that, right, Oscar Lewis comes up with this idea, but it's kind of taken up by other people and twisted, similar to actually Georges Condorcet's ethnography in the Vietnamese highlands, right, mountain communities, how that was taken up by U.S. Military folk and used to their own advantage. So structural violence, this is a concept that we've already talked about in class, right? So here, if we were in person, I would say, does anyone know the definition for structural violence, right? This was on your midterm and a lot of, or actually rather, I think witchcraft was on the midterm and structural violence wasn't. A lot of students thought it was structural violence. I can't remember now exactly which one was on the midterm. Anyway, structural violence, these are forms of suffering and injustice that are, in a sense, invisible to us. We're blind to them because they're so normalized, right? These are also, however, the structures that make our lives predictable, comfortable, secure, and pleasant, right? So I'm thinking about highways, right? They make it very easy and efficient and fast to get from one place to another. However, highways were constructed, and you'll learn this if you ever take a course with Dr. Finn, one of our 2 resident geographers at CNU. They were often constructed to go through Black communities in a lot of urban US contexts, right? So we don't think of them, we just take advantage of them, but also we need to recognize that they are a form of structural violence because it led to displacement, it led to increased noise pollution, etc. in those communities. So structural violence, again, can also be like a food desert, right? It's not necessarily a literal, obvious example of someone being punched in the face, but of course it is a violent social reality that leads to them not having access to fresh fruits and vegetables, for example. When we come to understand the idea of structural violence, we also come to recognize that people's living conditions aren't simply their fault, and they're not just how it is or natural, right? These are conditions that emerge out of a deeper historical and sociological, anthropological context, right? These are the result of socio-political institutions, right, as well as culture. So that brings us back to this other theme that we're looking at, right? How everything can't be reduced to culture. It's both culture and power. It's culture and structure. An important figure in the study of structural violence was anthropologist Paul Farmer, who worked in Haiti. He worked in Rwanda. He started low-cost medical clinics in those areas. And he's really an important voice in bringing anthropology to the public, finding ways in which we can use the vision of an anthropologist and apply it to world problems like public health. I like this picture as a way of illustrating structural violence, right? So direct violence, like I said, like that's being punched in the face, or like the obvious forms of violence through weapons, etc. Gun violence, right? That's kind of the tip of the iceberg. But we actually, when we think about structural violence, right, that is actually far more profound, far more common, impacts many more people all the time, right? Think about, for example, food insecurity being just one example of that. So race is the main topic for chapter 1 of this ethnography. Chapter 1 is titled Intimate Apartheid, and that should have given you some insight into the possibility of race being a major theme for chapter 1. The Edgewater homeless did not consider race to be a social construct, right? Instead, they saw racial differences as normal, as naturalized, as frankly, most Americans do, right? In fact, probably many of you also thought of race as being something you can see in your genes before you took this class and took the race and ethnicity unit. So that's why I've written here, Edgewater homeless believed in naturalized differences between Black and white Americans. Think, for example, when whites in the book said that African Americans only smoke crack. But in reality, as the ethnographers, the anthropologists noted, is because they were actually watching what people do as much as what they say, they saw that Edgewater whites also smoked crack, right? So it was not actually, in that sense, necessarily quite as racialized. There's also examples throughout the text of white interlocutors talking about Blacks as being more likely to commit crimes, right? An example of this is Hank. Hank is a white interlocutor who claimed to be the victim of Black criminality. But during their first year of fieldwork, the ethnographers saw that none of the white interlocutors were actually victims of Black crime. Like they never found any examples of that, but they did, in fact, find one African American evangelical Christian who allowed the homeless to sleep under his camper shell in one of his lots. So in fact, right, like one of the key people who helps the Edgewater homeless was a Black preacher. Why do you think that the Edgewater homeless thought that race or weren't able to see that race as a social construct? Right? Why do you think that the Edgewater homeless were not able to understand this idea that race is a social construct? It's something to think about. And again, as I've already mentioned, right, that's how most Americans think about race, that it's something that is natural, that's biologically clear and defined, which in fact, as we've talked about in class, is not. And you'll learn more about that if you take Anthropology 200. So in thinking about intimate apartheid, the title of this chapter, this brings us to this question of white flight. What does intimate apartheid specifically refer to? I will encourage you to pause this lecture and go to page 42. So please go ahead and open your text to page 42 and see if you can find where they talk about this concept of intimate apartheid. Intimate apartheid they define as the involuntary and predictable manner in which sharply delineated segregation and conflict impose themselves at the level of everyday practice, or practices, I should say. They use the term habitus, Habitus. This is a concept that comes to us from a famous sociologist named Bourdieu. You don't need to know that. But just think about habitus as the way that we explain embodied tastes, your preferences, right? As things that you're enculturated into, right? So, oh, this is a very nice fine wine, right? Like where you learn of wines as being finer than others based on the ideas that we are socialized into thinking or expecting, right? So how individuals are socialized or raised seems to have an impact on how they engage with folks from other racial or ethnic backgrounds. That's a key idea here. As is this concept of white flight. What is white flight? Do you know, have you ever heard of this concept before? I'm going to encourage you to pause the video and go ahead and click on this next link, which is an explanation of white flight. Can you think of an example of white flight from our ethnography? Think of Al, who's white, who grew up in an African-American neighborhood. He is the one white person in the Edgewater homeless community who chose to move to a Black encampment instead of living with the whites, right? So he's kind of an interesting example of someone who actually does the opposite, right? A white person who moves in with the Black community. And it's important to note something about his personal background and lived experience and why he felt more comfortable doing that. So there are, in other words, all sorts of racial tensions and hierarchies in the streets and ethnography, but it is important for you to understand the concept of white flight, right? Because it's a pattern that we see across the United States. And this is a great example of, here we have a little ethnographic story, a little ethnographic vignette, this small subculture of Edgewater homeless that speaks to this broader story, this broader structural pattern of human behavior that we see across the United States and during the 70s and 80s and 90s. Okay, and I think I'm going to pause the video here before I launch into the final section of this lecture.